Trafficking for sexual exploitation, disease of societies today, a perversion of the very gift of life in dimensions that are unbelievable. The Epstein case, just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to give you a glimpse tonight into how deep these tentacles of darkness reach into human societies and play out right literally under our nose, and shed some light on the path out of the darkness with the most recognized and brilliant minds in this field. All survivors turned leaders who turned their pain into light for the path out for the rest of us. And that means for people, for individuals, as well as for society, because sexual trafficking needs to end. And all of us can make a stand. Welcome on Smart Sustainability. I'm Nicolette de Vidar. The world is built on dreams. It's the magic fabric we all possess and bring with us when we're born. Pure light, pure innocence. Approximately 4.8 million worldwide are estimated to be trapped in forced sexual exploitation, according to the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. That is 4.8 million stolen dreams, stolen lives, stolen dignity, stolen innocence, and a multiple of that darkening the clouds in the sky that affect all of us here on the planet, all of societies, and all demographics. Around 99% of victims in forced sexual exploitation cases are women and girls. Men are affected as well, though. 50% of victims are estimated to be under the age of 18. Human trafficking for sexual exploitation generates an estimated $99 billion in profits per year. The most common form of human trafficking for sexual exploitation is within national borders. It accounts for 58% of all cases. So no one is off the hook, no one can look away, and no one should think it only happens in a land far, far away. The International Labour Organization estimates that approximately 4.1 million are victims of forced exploitation in Asia Pacific. Latin America and the Caribbean are also significant regions for sex trafficking, affecting an estimated 1.4 million. Europe had 11,700 recorded cases. Now, it's likely that many of these statistics may be heavily underreported. More often than not, justice is not happening. In a study of 113 cases in metropolitan areas in the U.S., including Phoenix, Seattle, Baltimore, Washington, where buyers were found guilty of buying sex with a minor, only 5 of these cases proceeded to trial. The rest settled on plea agreements. 81% of the guilty buyers were convicted of a felony, and none were charged with sex trafficking. Time to talk about missing justice, the makeup of victims, pimps and buyers, where demand is coming from, some of the dynamics, and what to look out for. And joining us today is an incredible lineup of guests. We got Jerome Elam, founder, president, and COO of Trafficking in America Task Force. He's a public speaker and columnist, and in 2023, Jerome received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the U.S. Attorney General's Alliance. We have Kelly Dorr, co-founder and executive director of Sierra Cares Foundation. She helps nonprofit leaders in war-torn nations with trauma, trafficking, and migrant repatriation. She developed the first trauma program for migrants returning home from captivity in other countries. A policy advisor for the Department of Justice, the FBI, and United Against Slavery on commercial sexual exploitation of children. We have Lydia Osivio-Festus, Nigerian activist, change agent on behalf of the CSO's Action Against Human Trafficking in person. She's a speaker on the origin and consequences of sex trafficking and joins us from Spain tonight. We got Chandra Vuvarantu, founder and CEO of Mentari Human Trafficking Survivor Empowerment Program. She testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, Ending Modern Slavery, Senate, and state courts. She was also appointed by President Obama in 2014 as member of the first U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. She's an Asian 100 New York's Asian American Trailblazers. And we got Dr. Suamir Spirano Guuzman, a behavioral neurologist and clinical psychologist specializing on human trafficking and trauma-informed care. Also a member, appointed by President Obama to serve as National Security Advisor and on the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. And he was appointed by the UN Secretary General as chair of the board for trustees for the UN Fund for Contemporary Forms of Slavery and Human Trafficking. And we have Tanya Gould, Anti-Human Trafficking Director for the Virginia Commonwealth's Attorney General's Office, and serves on the Governor's Commission on Human Trafficking Prevention. Just last year, Tanya received the Presidential Award for extraordinary efforts to combat human trafficking in person. Question, what's trafficking?
Human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion for a commercial sex act or labor act. You know you're being trafficked if you're being forced to engage in sex acts or forced to perform labor, and your movements are restrained, you're not being paid, and your life is basically being controlled by somebody else.
We're here in Virginia. Where does it happen?
Yes, definitely. Jerome is correct. It happens everywhere. Trafficking happens everywhere. It's easy for people to take who's being trafficked, where does it happen, what neighborhood, how much money a place or space makes, or But when you think about the demand, and here especially here in the United States, you can find trafficking everywhere, and from every age group and from every type of person.
And in every neighborhood, I presume, right?
Of course. Yeah. Absolutely.
Can you give us some statistics on Virginia, since we are in Northern Virginia, to make it also a little bit more relatable for our viewers? How much are we affected here?
So we are very much affected by human trafficking because the Commonwealth of Virginia is very diverse in its landscape, diverse in its people, and also when we're talking about industry. So, all over our Commonwealth, we have construction, we have clean energy bills that are passing through General Assembly, and a lot of talks on clean energy and bringing that to the area. We have military, and so all of these things have to be considered. We have a ton of agriculture, and we also have a huge tourist area. So, you have to consider all the industries that are here in the Commonwealth. And so because of that, our need to have to really think about the type of response that we do on the state and local level, and also working with the federal agencies on this is crucial. And that is what we're doing.
So technically, basically, you could meet a victim who's been sex trafficked, basically in a cafe you go to or in public places, and you would have no idea as a bystander, basically, to recognize that, correct?
Absolutely, and especially when it comes to our youth populations. I also serve as a mentor for one of our largest child advocacy centers, and we always get the uptick in trafficking instances during the summer. And so it is it happens naturally every year because of the tourists that comes to the area during the summer. And so it's in here in our Commonwealth, it's in our face. When we look at NCMEC, the National Center for Missing Exploited Children, we see that here in the Tidewater, which is where I live, the Tidewater, Hampton Roads area, we have the highest number of missing kids, especially those of Black and Brown communities.
Unbelievable. Where does justice stand right now for victims and survivors, Chandra?
Where is justice?
Yeah, just give us a snapshot. Like, where does justice stand on this right now? What sort of, if you had to describe it, how could we perceive where the justice system, where justice in general right now is sort of located, standing on this whole issue? Just a snapshot.
Justice means equally serve to victim and survivor of trafficking, to prosecute the trafficker and the allies, and also prosecute the sex buyers and give services to victim and survivor in the reintegration back into society so they can live independently. This is justice. If we have the law, we need law enforcement to enforce the law and work together with victim, with service provider to make sure the perpetrator will be arrested. And
that brings me on to Kelly. Kelly, what are some of the current legal impediments that we see in terms of finding or getting to that justice that we actually just talked or heard about?
Absolutely. So some of the legal issues that we're seeing, there's a lot of misinformation, and I think there's a lack of communication, especially amongst a lot of law enforcement agencies. Anywhere between from district attorney offices to state and local and even federal authorities, even communicating together. Consistently, we don't have laws across the board that actually address this or make sense. Here in the United States, and we see this in other countries as well, every state sort of sets their own laws. And so, federal law does not always trump state laws. And so it just sort of depends on how they're implemented and what they're there for. But one of the things that we're seeing in the criminal justice system is that a lot of human trafficking, the victimology and even understanding the crimes itself. For example, in my home state in Colorado, we have something called Title 18, and Title 18 is basically the criminal code, and that's basically what law enforcement, what district attorneys, the Attorney General office, what they use to decide on how that they are going to prosecute and how they are going to charge people involved in cases. But what we're really seeing with that is there's a lot of misinformation, miscommunication, and also survivors being missed amongst law enforcement because they're not necessarily being identified as victims of human trafficking.
Lydia, right now a snapshot, is demand increasing? And generally, where are the buyers from?
When I'll say with the demand is coming from Europe. I'll talk on the African women side of trafficking. We are being trafficked to Europe because is where the demand is. This is where the buyers are willing to pay to get the body of an African woman being destroyed and being monopolized. So the demand in European market for African women is very, very high.
We live in a society that really likes cheap things, that likes things that are easily accessible, are easily put together, easily chopped, easily to purchase, and we just really are obsessed as a global community. We're obsessed with things that are fast, they're cheap, they're easily accessible. But what happens on the other side of that cheap and accessible clothing, for example, is that there is abuse. People are being forced to cultivate the tomatoes that you buy on your burger every day. There is, for example, tomatoes in the United States is one of the products where labor trafficking is used and forced exploitation is used the most to cultivate tomatoes. Yet tomatoes are sold in every burger that you purchase, and there are restaurants in this country that actually rather pay fines. They're signing on to a pledge that says that they will not use tomatoes from known traffickers, from known exploiter fields.
So is there an addiction to cheap things, as you say it?
There's a psychology to it, right? There's a biological response. We always want to, I think that in the United States, for example, we have a mentality of really trying to conserve, really trying to, we went, if you look at the 1920s, for example, people got used to kind of pinching almost like, and that had led into a society that is always looking to purchase the cheap things. And there are programs, for example, like the ICW-online.org. You can go to that website and you can put your favorite your favorite shrimp company, and it will tell you what do they rank in the global scale of human rights, and whether forced labor is being used to cultivate their shrimps. Your seafood. I mean, I can tell you a part of my cell phone and my watch. I know exactly where each of the products that I'm wearing actually come from. Right? It's about making conscientious decisions, and that's one way that we will tackle labor trafficking. That's one way that we tackle the demand for it, and I think that also has a biological, perhaps manifestation when it comes to slowing people from purchasing sex or engaging in other forms of exploitive ways of looking for thrills, right? Like the same thing, the same mentality that goes into purchasing something cheap, the mentality goes into forcing somebody against your will to work or to engage in a commercial sex act against their will.
Is there actually a connection between the self-value of feeling really low for the buying cheap mentality? I mean, normally, like if you have a higher self-worth, if we as a society had a higher self-worth, for example, wouldn't we look more for something that is a higher, how should I say that, something that's more of a higher value over having this drive for going cheap?
Absolutely. I think that, definitely, and you can see that why big brands are able to sell to people who make below minimum wage.
So when we talk about victim, there is a lot of misconceptions, I think, in terms of who a victim is. If you ask people on the street and you would ask them who's a victim of sexual trafficking, I think you'd get a very standardized answer, and I want to challenge this here a little bit. So describe to us what are the many faces of a victim of sexual trafficking, Jerome?
Thank you, Nicola, for that question. It can be anybody. I mean, unfortunately, with the advent of the internet, and especially during COVID, anybody can be targeted. I think one of the things that we talk quite frequently about is there's no real cure for teenage insecurity. So they are a readily available target for human traffickers. And if you look at the research that's being done, especially who's being targeted, it's teenagers who can't find a connection with a peer group and are looking for acceptance, have a disconnect with their parents. And so they're looking for some acceptance. And so they look anywhere, and these traffickers know that, and they'll go in and just target them and take advantage of them. And I just want to say, for my own particular story, I came from a very dysfunctional family. So as a child, I was desperate for affection, like a drowning man's desperate for oxygen. So when my trafficker showed me 5 seconds of attention, he had me. And so I became trapped in this cycle. So anybody can be targeted by human trafficking. That's what's so critical. I know everyone here agrees that we educate everybody, especially children, about when they're being targeted by human traffickers, because they're so good at going after our young people. And, grooming, which I call, psychological quicksand, is something that they're very, very sly about, and they'll go in without you knowing it. And before you know it, they have you trapped and being forced and being sold for sex.
Yeah, but I want to hear a little bit more about the faces, because it always sounds like anybody can be it, but that somehow seems distant. Give me a description of some more of the faces, like some of the descriptions. Can it be a wealthy girl of any demographic from a family? Can it be a poor person? Can it be someone who's give us some description? And that question actually goes to any of you if you want to chime in. Give us sort of like some of the faces. Describe them.
Well, I have a very close friend, and her father was an executive at one of the big three automakers in Detroit. She liked a boy in high school, and one day the boy offered her a ride home, which she thought was okay, stopped by his house. She thought his parents were going to be there, and they weren't. He gave her a soda laced with drugs, and she passed out. She was sexually assaulted by this guy and his friends, and then they took photos and blackmailed her. And she used to crawl out of her window in the middle of the night when they would call to be trafficked. So, it spans the whole spectrum. I mean, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, it doesn't really matter. I mean, you can be targeted no matter who you are. And we know that, a lot of people that you see here right now are truly representative of what the face of a victim or survivor of human trafficking really is. So it could be, a kid at Beverly Hills High School. It could be a kid, in the inner city in Chicago. I mean, anybody can be targeted and be trafficked. And that's why it's just so critical that we educate our young people and everyone else when they're being targeted, isolated by a trafficker, and forced into doing something like sex or labor.
Now, is blackmail always a part of the whole thing, Tanya? Is this always part of the equation to make a victim basically, obey?
There are a number of factors. So traffickers look for vulnerability, right? So if you can imagine, like your question earlier, the demand is great. And because the demand is great, anyone can be trafficked, right? So traffickers I've heard, traffickers say something like, I can find anybody to work for me. I can just find a person on the street or coming in and out of a business or an area or just a place, just where they're minding their business, and convince them, find out what their, basically their vulnerabilities, and use that, because this is their job. Like, this is what they do. Like, when you go to work, you know that you have a demand to meet, you have a supply to meet, and you figure out what you need to do to make that happen. And this is the mind of a trafficker, and the demand is so great. I was just talking to an FBI agent, and they said that their oldest the oldest person in their case was 102 years old.
What?
102-year-old woman was being trafficked. To me, that tells us the story of demand and how evil this is.
So there is no age limit. Yeah, so there's no age limit. There is no, it really comes down to perverted demands, basically, the perverted tastes of whatever people look for. Unbelievable.
Absolutely. There's money to be made. That's the trafficker's mindset. Right. And there's money to be made in this space for cheap work or cheap sex or cheap labor, whatever it is. There's money to be made there. So whatever a trafficker can do to keep their business going, that is what they're gonna do. And they're gonna find a vulnerability. And everyone has one. That's why this is so relatable. That's why no one can say, oh, that could never happen to me. My question to them is, are you aware of your own vulnerabilities?
And I want to talk about that, exactly. Let's go a little bit into the vulnerabilities. What can those vulnerabilities actually be? Because they vary, as you just said, right? It could be, and most people are not aware of their vulnerabilities. It could be anything.
Yeah, so, I think that I appreciate what Tanya said is, a vulnerability is literally the what puts a victim on a silver platter to be exploited, right? Vulnerabilities are anything, right? Anywhere from a disability, a person who is who can walk, who can speak, who can communicate, somebody who has experienced adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, which could be anywhere from I was sexually assaulted as a minor to for example, I was in foster care, my parent was incarcerated, I lived in a community that was danger, there occurred, all of these events that happen at childhood often are the things that places people in this vulnerable stage to then being exploited. And traffickers, and this is what I think is so dangerous about traffickers, that they know exactly how to use that vulnerability. Vulnerability can be exploited through acts of okay, you don't have nobody to protect you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to love you. I'm going to provide you everything. And that being a hero, but then I say, okay, well, now you have to show me love by sleeping with this person or doing this work for me. Then it goes through that, right? It can be love. It could be a financial status, like immigrants, for example, who come to this country, who are seeking protection, who are seeking asylum, are put to work against their will on egg farms and chicken farms all across the Midwest, all because they're immigrants in this country. They have no documentations, who are being told, if you seek the police or if you do this or you try to leave, we're kind of called immigration. And as an immigrant, immigration to me is this very dangerous, ugly bear that is going to kill me, right? So, and that is how we have a group of millions of people across this country who are being exploited. So that is what vulnerability is, right? It's not necessarily, it's all that really makes a person is their experiences, their background, who they are, their sexual identity, their experience with racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other forms of systematic racism. That is what drives That's what makes trafficking thrive in this country, because all of those issues, social, political, familial, community level, all of these issues exist in a way that creates the perfect storm, the perfect like platform for people to be exploited. Plus, then we have a community who is seeking these trails, so seeking cheap sex, cheap things, and all of these things, and that's how people become exploitive.
Now, we live in a society where there is a lot of trauma. I think everyone can agree on that trauma is just humongous in a lot of different things. So what role, though, plays trauma in a trauma bonding, for example, that people experience, also in your vulnerability to become a victim, but also at some point to become a perpetrator? What's the vulnerability? What's the role of trauma in that, Kelly?
So, honestly, really, trauma is one of the root causes of not only vulnerabilities, but for trafficking in persons, whether or not it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking. But then also, on top of it, one of the things that we don't discuss, I think, worldwide, and we're starting to talk about it a little bit more, but it's the element of just the generational trauma that has happened within families, and really the normalization of trauma that happens, but also attached to an element of silence and shame. And so, we know as survivors that whenever somebody's story has to be silenced or their voice is silenced, we really recognize that that's where there are elements of trauma, but you also see the cycles that continue to perpetuate themselves. So for example, Dr. Swammer has talked about how immigrants are really affected by, especially like when it comes to labor trafficking or coming into this country, and really their immigration status is being held to a level of almost like, if you don't do what we tell you to do, then you're going to be in trouble. And that's very much the same for even child survivors or even children. We know that there's a lot of studies out there, and nearly 87% of adult survivors have had some sort of psychological or childhood trauma that has led to the existence of vulnerability, but also to the existence of them being trafficked. And so, for example, someone like me, I say to people, I was born into this world and into this element. I didn't know any better. My abuse started by my biological father when I was 1 year old, and then continued until I was 14 years old, and really figured out in school that this wasn't normal. This wasn't something that little kids did all the time, and we just didn't talk about it. And so I think, there's that culture of silence that and family shame that permits and allows for the existence of trafficking to happen and child abuse to happen. And also things that lead to, we don't deal with the addiction issues that come out of trauma, that lead to families being broken up, that lead to children going into the foster care system. I was a top student. I was one of the top soccer players in the state. I was able to play anywhere I wanted. I really lived two lives, and it's because I learned how to do that and live with the duality of that. And I wasn't just like the poor kid. I lived in an affluent community. I wasn't the poor child that just was missed within the system. I was a child that was missed across the board in a system that didn't know what they were looking for. And so, this is why we say there's elements of trafficking survivors that are in plain sight. They're in your schools, they're in churches. I believe actually in 2016, there was a study that the University of Virginia did where they actually found that there was one or more instances of human trafficking in every single public high school in the United States of America. And so, that's really concerning when we recognize that. And then couple that on top with nearly 23% of the perpetrators are minors themselves. So we've got children perpetrating on children. And so you've got these cycles of trauma and different factors that lead to the different vulnerabilities, which we're not recognizing or comprehending, I think, as a whole, when we're looking at what do we look like and what does it look like? Yeah. Every single one of us here is the face of what human trafficking looks like. And so, there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's really, as Tanya said, it's about the vulnerabilities. It's about who is exposed to those vulnerabilities. But how do we as a culture and as a society address some of those vulnerabilities so that we can end the perpetuation of the cycles?
Yeah. Now, you mentioned when we previously spoke, Kelly, you mentioned that Ghislaine Maxwell, because it's such a prominent case right now, but this is like, is that a classic case of multi-generational passing on kind of development?
Oh, absolutely. And it's really hard because we even see their elements. So there's something, especially on the sex trafficking side, we call them bottoms. And these are survivors that literally have had to move to a level and out of survival and self-preservation themselves and existing through their day-to-day trauma, they become bottoms. So they essentially are aiding the pimps and the traffickers and in recruitment and bringing younger people in, and really bringing more victims in, all and really all to make money for the trafficker or the criminal organization, whatever it is. But someone like Ghislaine Maxwell, I think absolutely could be considered not only just a bottom in that situation, but she grew up in a household where sexual abuse was prominent. I mean, it was well known that her father sexually abused her and abused her. And then you see the connections, and we wonder why. Right now with the Epstein cases, all of the cases that are moving forward are civil. None of them are criminal right now. And so with the exception of Ghislaine and with Jeffrey Epstein. And some of that is because of the people who are involved. For example, even, and I'm not going to sit here and say that our Secretary of State knows this, but his father, he grew up in France and in Paris with under the circles of Ghislaine Maxwell as well. And his own father was known as somebody who abused children as well. And so when you've got these cultures and these different variations and people in power who are contributing to this, and which is one of the reasons it's been a fight to even get the lists, everybody on the Epstein list, pushed forth out and to get the information there. But on top of it, we also have to recognize our criminal justice system, we are guilty until proven, or innocent until proven guilty. And so just because somebody's name was on a plane log doesn't necessarily
mean anything.
They were contributing to that as well.
Yeah.
But when you see these cycles of power, and for victims really being in these situations, if they're gosh, our Secretary of State, his own father was involved in this stuff, and it goes way up the chain. Where is that element of trust? And so you're not going to trust that law enforcement's going to stand up for you, that anybody who is supposed to stand up for you is going to do that. And so if we're seeing that,
this is exactly, because it's going so high up, and that's kind of then really the iffy part. Lydia, I want to ask you, when you found yourself being a victim in a situation like this, sort of at one point did you realize that you're really trapped and you had a feeling that this was going so high up that that it felt like there was no way out?
I'm going to say that because when I was in Africa, when I was offered to be brought to Europe, it was kind of my trafficker was offering me help. I thought she was helping me, with the false promises and all. Okay, when I got to nowhere, then I knew I was in for a real big shit. Okay, what I wanted to was, she said I was going to make hair because I make hair in Africa. So she had a shop. Okay, I said, fine, I'm going to work. When I came in and I saw the situation, I know there was no way out. It's either you're in or maybe your parents are dead in Africa. Because what makes we African women stays in the traffickers' hands? Because they threaten our families back home. There's nothing you can do till you comply with your trafficker to pay the debt that you were brought to Europe to pay. Secondly, you can't go to the police because you have been instigated with fear. First, they put fear into you that when you speak to the police or to any law enforcement agent, you'll be going back to Nigeria, and which is deportation. Everybody's scared to be deported. So when I saw myself in the mess, I knew there was no way out. I have to comply with my trafficker so that I can buy my freedom. How am I going to buy my freedom? It's for me to go to the street and work and pay the money and have my freedom. Without that, there was no way out. So that was the only way I could come out. After paying my debt, I was able to live a free life. So when I came in, I know it was a mess. I could not fight. I could not go anywhere for help. I couldn't talk to anybody. My documents were seized. I have no means of going back. So the only option I had at that moment was to comply with her, pay her my money, then have my freedom. So when it got to the point I paid her money, I was able to have my freedom, get my passport back, then I started a new life. So being trapped in a web of traffic, of prostitution, what the only option you have is to follow the rules your trafficker gave to you so that you can be free.
Yeah,
That's
that brings me to Chandra here, because I know, Chandra, you focus on empowerment, that's a big focus of your program, right? So tell us, how do you actually re-establish and rebuild, in a way, the whole trust in working with someone, trust in actually not just working in someone, but really developing trust in life, and also trust in believing in society? What are sort of the key pillars of that path?
Number one, I do all of this because I have passion and compassion. I learned from my experience. I was a victim. The survival was so difficult until I became who I was at that time. So lesson learned from what I experienced dealing with law enforcement, dealing with investigation, with the court system, and also with service provider. I was homeless for 3 years. So I realized that survivors need sustainable and stable support along the way until the reintegration into community and society with full potential independence. So this is my goal. Because I was there, I fight for myself, and I get there. So how to build the trust is to put myself on their shoes, understanding what they experience. I have sensitivity of the culture, religion, and also the cases, the cases that build upon this person. To understand that is learning the need, first need, secondary need, and also additional need that someone needs the most. And also consider protection is number one. And also understanding which need that they have to get according for themselves individually. We cannot just give them. Example, I need water, don't give me bread. And I need protection, don't give me clothes. So all of this, we need to have holistic, comprehensive, trauma-informed, individual victim or survivor approach to fulfill their need. So that's how the trust continue build, and we will be able to help them individually and move into collective help.
Now, you all have different experiences, though. Could you say that there is actually one red thread of a certain need that all of you have in common who've gone through that?
Yes. The first common is how we feel safe, especially most of the cases in New York City. The challenges is housing. Housing could be emergency shelter, could be long-term shelter, could be transitional home. This is our challenges, because without that home, someone will be vulnerable to be re-trafficked. Understanding what they need, mental health and health, will be accompany this person go through the recovery and healing journey. And then, of course, food. Food is very challenges,
right?
Because of we don't only serve domestic U.S. citizen, but we also know that people came to the U.S. to be exploited and trafficked. So we have to understand. In my case, I was Indonesian girl that came to this country. I didn't eat sandwich.
Yeah.
During the investigation, I want to have rice.
Yeah.
But they give me sandwich. Will I comply? So this is a question to everybody. Will I comply when you give me sandwich and I don't know what type of food is that? So this is just one question. Commonality is being safe, have a house, have food to eat, and also have the bed that I can enjoy a night's sleep. Because of when we are trafficked, we were starving, we have sleep derivative beside emotional abuse, physical abuse, and some of sexual abuse.
Tanya, are there actually similar programs that are across the various states, or is this like, does Virginia have its own, New York State has its own, or is there actually some real collaboration happening?
You mean as far as victim services? Okay, so yeah, we do have each year we do better with our coordinated responses, because here in Virginia, we actually have our Virginia State Police. We have them leading and co-partnering with our federal agencies, FBI and HSI, and are really working to make sure local law enforcement are trained, and we're also working with department or state agencies like juvenile justice system and social services, and working with hospitals. So yes, we are working to have a coordinated response, a trauma-informed coordinated response. But yeah, like Kelly mentioned earlier, it's different in every state. They do it different, and we also have the National Human Trafficking Hotline here. And in our state, Virginia, we also have VSP, Virginia State Police, has their own tip line to help with the capacity of how many tips or calls that the helpline is getting. So we are doing our best to take responsibility and bringing in our business partners, and offering trainings to hotels. And so looking more at training industry, so there can be responsibilities there, working on that, and also, of course, working through legislation, and just really supporting our agencies and making sure that they have what they need, including our shelters. We want to make sure that our shelters and homes, whether it's drop-in to long-term care, we want to make sure we know what their needs are and help in supporting them. But yeah, we have a new youth shelter in our Commonwealth that'll be opening up very shortly.
Now, we have about 9 minutes left, so I want to condense it here and talk a little bit about practicalities. Also in terms of, I think we have all good understanding who the pimp can be and who the buyer can be, in terms of it can be really anyone, and people you don't suspect, and usually where you think it's the good guys, right? So you would think, oh, they wouldn't do that, but you got to look a little deeper. I want to talk a little bit about the process. How does one become, what are the different stages of that a victim goes through in the process, and how do you recognize it, and what are the resources you have available for people to get out? So let's start with the stages. Dr. Zwamir, you want to take that one?
I guess I think that while all of us have very unique ways at the different stages and how we were exploited. So I think that most commonly, though, I think we have to acknowledge, I think there's a big elephant in the room when it comes to exploitation, especially of young people right now. The number one way that young people are being exploited in this country right now are through their families. It is the number one way. So, and to acknowledge that specific fact, then we need to acknowledge that often they know it's poverty pushing these issues. There's a pull and push factor. That whether if it is looking for cheap things to trying to find trying to get better or trying to get healthier, trying to live up to societal expectations, right? Like all of those issues kind of push you up the ladder to being exploited. But usually what happens is the exploiter will notice either somebody is walking home from school by themselves, and this is a constant recurrent, right? So you know that this person is alone from this period of time every single day from school. Then perhaps that young person is not being walked to school.
Right.
It's not picked up from school because a parent has to work and the other parent is incarcerated, right? So then you add to these things, and then perhaps they live in a very dangerous area of town where there is a lot of gangs, so there's a lot of just a society that is not necessarily looking out for each other, but looking at each other in ways that they can exploit each other. So I think that in little by little, a trafficker will start noticing those patterns of things that puts a person at a higher risk, right? Then perhaps then it start being truants from school.
Yeah, but like if you're a victim, like what are the stages you're going to? Is there grooming stage for every victim?
Absolutely, but you have to understand that grooming is different, right? Like the grooming could be anywhere from I have a need to could be anywhere from I'm trying to get what I need, right? To try to make their needs met. So grooming is not necessary, but doesn't apply for every person, right? It could be very on the set, right? Like somebody can be taken immediately being exploited. Like Tanya said that she knows somebody that could actually said like within 24 hours I could put somebody to be sold, or within a couple hours, right? Or it could be this process to like acknowledging all of these different areas in life where this person is not receiving support, and then trying to fulfill that support system and then ultimately exploit them. Or it could be that immigrant that just crossed over the border who now the trafficker to the smuggler is saying to them, okay, you need a place to stay, come with me to this farm, and then you can get to work there, and then they kind of pay you, and then they make all these promises, but once they get to the farm, then they're not getting paid. So there's different ways that people do that, and I wish that, and honestly I think that's one of the hardest things in the anti-trafficking movement is that we want to point it, we want to like hold it and want to say tangible, but the reality is that vulnerabilities are so individualized that each person anybody can be exploited, and that's the hard reality to understand as a society and community.
Let's talk about some of those signs as an observer that you could detect to see if someone may be in a circumstance where they might be trafficked. So let's say you sit somewhere and what would you look out for? Are there certain languages? Are there certain signs that we wouldn't recognize? What would you say, Jerome?
I would say absolutely. I mean, I think that we can look at, at-risk populations. We all know what that looks like. I mean, kids who, like single-parent families, I mean, where that parent is so overwhelmed just trying to care for that child, where there's a vulnerability that exists. Again, we talk about people immigrating into this country who, are just looking for honest work. And they can be targeted by someone, their passport taken away. I mean, people are recruited. I mean, Justine Maxwell was not only, a bottom, but she also was a procurer. I mean, she went out and went after and recruited people. So I think that we can look at those vulnerabilities that exist, within the adult and with the juvenile populations, and try and step in before the trafficker does and fill that need. That's what we need.
Yeah, but if a kid is already with a trafficker, how do you, let's say you are in a restaurant or something and you see something that's kind of fishy, what do you do? How do I know when this is a situation where you say, stop, I gotta do something about that?
If a child is being controlled, if they can't speak for themselves, they're being told to do things that make them uncomfortable, if they're not in control of money, typically when we educate within the school system, we'll look at kids, have what we call burner phones, disposable phones, hotel keys, on social media, they have very sexually explicit, profiles. So a child who is pretty much being dominated by another adult and forced to do things that they don't want to do, that can be a very strong sign of human trafficking. But again, like I tell people, trust your gut. If you see a situation with a child that doesn't seem right, then you really need to go and look deeper and report that if you can. Because again, when someone's being groomed by a trafficker, by the time they're done, they have total control of that child. I mean, as a victim, I was in fear for my life every second that I was being trafficked. So I did as I was told. I mean, he threatened my mother's life. My mother was an alcoholic, but irregardless, I would do anything to protect my mom. So if a child is being controlled, they're being, they're not control their money, they're not able to speak, their eyes are down all the time, they don't make eye contact. I mean, there are definite signs there you can pick up on. In my case as a child, being picked up by different cars after school, different adults every day after school. The absence of parents. That child is malnourished. They really, are sick and in need of attention. So all these are definitely clues that something is going on deeper that we need to pay attention to. But I think the biggest thing is communication. We need to be able to talk to children and make it okay for them to tell them that something's wrong in their lives, and we're not going to judge them or react negatively.
Okay, but that brings up a really interesting questions that I have to ask all of you here, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. So the point is, when you have people where you talk to someone, let's say you have a kid on your street and you realize that kid is alone a lot and has issues and all sorts of things, and you start talking to that child, and let's say you build a rapport with that child. Where is there, though, the common sense element that you say this is a healthy, caring relationship of maybe an adult who lives on the street who looks out for the child versus someone where you'd say there's a real danger that this kid can be trafficked or is being groomed? Any takers, Lydia?
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell myself, let me comment this. Yeah. According to what you said, that there are different things to look at for children that are being trafficked. There are some children that are being trafficked that when you try to get to be close with them, you know that they are trafficked. Because there was a child case I'm working on. She's 16 years old. She was brought to Spain where I live. So I saw her in the Red Cross Society where they go to seek for food and medicine. So I was trying to talk to her because she was very young, and I know you couldn't come to Europe on your own because normally you don't have the resources, you don't have the money to come. So definitely you were brought in by a trafficker, So I got close to her, I tried talking to her, but she was like giving me a statement that was already given to her to read. That was the first time I knew that she was brought here, because they ask you, if anybody asks you brought you, you said your mother brought you, which the same thing I passed through. So I was able to know she was trafficked. I offered her coffee, took her phone number. I don't call her home. When she's out, she calls me. For like 2 weeks, I was able to gain her trust, and she opened up to me, which we were able to report to the police, and the case was resolved. So a child or a young girl that is being trafficked, first, you have to gain their trust first before you can meet them to start talking with them. You understand? And secondly, they look very, very scared. They are scared. They don't talk to fellow Africans. That is the number one law they give to them. Don't talk to blacks like you. Don't talk to the police. Don't talk to black. Don't talk to whites. So when you see them, they are very, very scared. They are not social. They don't intertwine with people. They don't go into social gatherings. They are always excluded. They are always scared, don't want to talk. So when you see those kind of signs, if you can be able to gain the trust of that person, the person will be able to talk to you.
What would need to happen as our wrapping up? Like, what are some of the solutions? And then how much is actually the legal system an enabler of it? I mean, it has to be quick, but I'm going to call on Kelly on this one. What is like 1 or 2 most pressing issues for really fixing, if you want to use that word, the legal system to stop enabling that kind of abuse?
Well, I think the greatest thing is that we need to, have an honest and hard conversation. We talk across the board, and, there's sort of always like this running joke amongst societies that's like prostitution is the oldest type of profession around the world. And quite honestly, like for a lot of us that have been in it, it's the oldest oppression that has been around the world. Yeah. And so, part of it is really recognizing, within societies, until we stop labeling people for product, profit, or pleasure, and looking at them and value, assessing a value to them based on their humanity and what we think they're worth, deemed based off of like where they've come from, who they are, what their family situation is. And so until we start recognizing that, but we also, we talk about that human beings are not for sale. They cannot be bought. And so, as Dr. Swamir said earlier, being conscious about the things that we purchase, what we buy. Here in the United States, it's a huge thing to everybody wants a Tesla, everybody wants an electric vehicle, not recognizing that the majority of electric vehicles, unless you're buying them from Germany right now, are all child-made labor batteries. So the cobalt and the lithium that goes into them are typically from child mines in Africa or even in Asian countries as well. And so having those conversations with people, holding people accountable, but at the end of the day, if we don't address the demand and we don't stop seeing people again as product, and also recognizing not only the demand for cheap labor and cheap goods, but also that sex is a human right for people. If we don't start having these conversations and we don't start saying, no, it's not a human right to purchase somebody else for your own profit, product, or pleasure, we're never going to get anywhere. And so even within societies and within the laws, until we start culturally changing, again, like how we honor the dignity of every human being, we're not going to change this at all. And so it doesn't matter what laws, there can be laws created, but if the laws are not applicable to the people that they are supposed to represent, they're just a piece of paper. And so, this is what getting our legislators, getting our government officials, and really even, I have a hard time with some of our legislators now. They continue to use the word child prostitute. And I say to them, no, there is no such thing as a child prostitute. A child cannot consent. A minor cannot consent. Adults are different. But if we are going to lump everybody into the same box, we're never going to really be able to tackle this scourge. And that also includes having the conversations and holding other countries accountable and other governments accountable as well. I mean, for example, in the United States, we need to stop making alliances with China and hold them accountable for the egregious human rights that are things that are happening there. And the same thing here in the US. We need to be held accountable as well for the human rights aggressions and aggressions that we permit to happen across the board in the name of really not in humanity, but it's for the betterment of a society or for certain populations in the society to do better. So, until we really recognize and see people as human beings, I don't know how we actually address this across
and this
the board.
is the big shift that needs to occur. It means really this big shift away from the mechanistic worldview of seeing everything as a thing versus seeing the sacred, the divinity in everyone and in every living being to make this paradigm shift. Really, I think this is the big call to kind of work from society, really from the bottom up. So Chandra, final word for you. What would you say are the two most important things for empowerment that someone needs to take their own power back?
This is a good question. Because why? We have two empowerment, self-empowerment and external empowerment. Self-empowerment developed by ourselves, that we have to believe that there will be hope out there. Let's make the world better together.
And on that ending, great ending, thank you so much for all of you to come on. I do look forward actually to continue our conversation one-on-one, to go a little bit more in depth in all of this and turn it into a podcast. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And for our viewers, thank you very much for listening in and tuning in. And as you heard, we really do need